Welcome to the Green Enterprise Podcast. I'm Leonard Alf, its host. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, a conversation with Professor Cass Sunstein. You can find more of these conversations on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify, and follow our work at gre-enterprise.org. Cass Sunstein is the founder and director of the Program in Behavioral Economics and Public Policy at Harvard Law. He's also a recipient of the Holberg Prize from the government of Norway, which is sometimes described as the equivalent of a Nobel Prize for law and the humanities. In addition, he served at OIRA under President Obama and was appointed in 2020 as the chair of the WHO's Technical Advisory Group on Behavioural Insights and Sciences for Health. More recently, Mr. Sunstein has joined the Department of Homeland Security and is a key element of the Biden administration's effort to reset climate policy. A thinker, speaker, and regulator of global import, and a household name among scholars of law, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Professor Sunstein and pick up on some of the deep insights that he has to offer about society, choice, values, precaution, and risk. Professor Sunstein, it's a great pleasure to talk with you.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I guess as an initial point, you're very well known for your nudge theory. But one of the things I saw when researching you was your book on Star Wars. Awesome. Would you just talk a little bit about that? How does it bear on your understanding of the world?
Well, probably it bears on my understanding mostly of the movies, my work on Star Wars, rather than the world. And it's a little, what's the right word, a little desperate to try to say my understanding of the world is a product of Star Wars. So I'd say I really like Star Wars, and it has some things to say about freedom of choice and about redemption and about parents and children, and those are relevant to our daily life. So I enjoyed greatly thinking about Star Wars, but I can't say that if we want to understand democracy and climate change and magic, that Star Wars is the end all and be all. Though it does have some interesting things to say about all of those questions.
Of course. And well, that reminds me of a point within your theories of your many theoretical ideas. One of the ones that struck me and I'd like to ask you about is incompletely theorized agreements. So correct me if I'm wrong, but just within the legal field, legal minimalism, incompletely theorized agreements would be the idea that parties can come to an agreement without having fully explored the underlying theoretical territory that would bear on a specific case. Is that kind of an appropriate characterization?
Exactly right. So you might think that freedom of speech is really important and that people should be allowed to say things that others find very disagreeable, even if you don't have clarity or consensus on the theoretical foundations for that view. So you might believe that people have a right to private property. Wouldn't be an unlimited right, I hope, but that there is a right to private property. Well, some people are utilitarians and others believe in something Kantian and others believe in maybe something Aristotelian, and others think that the terms Kantian and utilitarian and Aristotelian are off-putting or baffling. And that allows often in law and in policy progress to be made, first in the face of humility about theoretical foundations, and second, in the midst of intense disagreement. Some people may have theological commitments which are driving their belief in freedom of religion, for example, and others may think that theological commitments are foreign to them, and yet they believe in freedom of religion. And often societies work well and amicably and respectfully because we agree what to do, even as we don't agree exactly on why to do it.
Right, and we certainly do live in times of disagreement. How would you say that a incompletely theorized agreement could work with regards to climate change?
think we're seeing it in real time, where some people favor, for example, aggressive controls on greenhouse gas emissions from automobiles because they're focused on public health. And they think that if you do that, you will reduce risk to public health. Others think that it's important for economic growth, that if you have a lot of climate change and volatility with respect to climate, you may have adverse economic effects, even if they are uncertain about the public health effects exactly. There are other people who think that there's entrepreneurial opportunity here, and that if we have aggressive controls on air pollution from motor vehicles, we're going to spur technology to the future, and maybe for the relevant nation, we will get an economic gain that's very high and promote employment and reduce poverty. And others think that the planet is God's creation, and to do something that is violent in some way to it is inconsistent with their deepest moral commitments. And these are really different views, but they may all converge on let's reduce greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles.
Mm-hmm. There's certainly a lot to be said for each of them. How does the social implication of risk and then availability cascades? So the idea that, in a way, we, the fact that facts about a certain part of the discourse are more present or less present. How does that influence biases towards one view compared to another?
Okay, great. So let's start with the individual mind, that if we are thinking about whether, let's say, abandoned hazardous waste dumps are a serious environmental problem, or whether we should be worried about dirty water. Some people will want to think in terms of numbers and statistics, but the human mind is drawn to available incidents. So if we can think of cases where abandoned hazardous waste dumps cause serious health problems, or cases where people were drinking dirty water and getting sick, that will be available to the mind, and our probability judgments will very probably be affected. So the availability heuristic is a mental shortcut that people use to assess risk. If you don't have a cognitively available example of something bad happening, you might think the probability that it will happen is actually low. It's a rule of thumb. Now, of course, the availability heuristic works in society. It doesn't work in the hands of isolated people living their whole life on some island. So what's available it depends on what's socially transmitted. And an availability cascade occurs when an incident goes from one person to another person. And I'm going to make this very stylized. Then two people think it. Then if two people think it, a third might hear it and believe it both to be credible and representative. And then a fourth person would have to be pretty stubborn or skeptical to reject the shared view of three people, and now four people believe it. And now you're creating a cascade, which can, keeping a toy example, be transmitted to tens of thousands or even millions of people. And though it's a toy example, we've seen it. You can take your pick with respect to risk, where a story or an event that's real affects risk judgments on the part of very many people, often in a really rapid time. It could happen on social media. It could happen because of regular media. So that's an availability cascade. And it can be a wonderful thing when people get suddenly alert to what is really a serious risk. Or it can be a not so wonderful thing as people get really alarmed about something that isn't deserving of alarm. The social amplification of risk is a different idea. It's an overlapping idea where a risk comes to fruition and then it's amplified through social processes such that the costs that it imposes are way in excess of it standing by itself. So you may have an incident, let's say an airplane, something, and then everyone knows about it, and then the costs proliferate because everyone knows about it. People might not want to fly. People might drive instead. driving instead of flying might result in deaths. It may be that there are economic effects that way outrun the single incident. And you can think of many incidents, the terrorist attacks of 9/11 are prominent among them, in which the social amplification of the risk, this is just a descriptive point, this isn't a claim that this is a bad thing, but the social amplification of risk will result in an assortment of add-on things that outrun the original incident.
Yeah, and it can affect our perception about the goodness or relative badness of an incident. Just to make an example, if a cell within a body dies, I mean, maybe we could give that the death of that cell a badness grade of 1, but if that happens to 200 million cells within the body, it's not 200 million because it affects overall the health of the organism in a different way.
I think that's fair. So if society is amplifying a risk, take an example of a flood, which creates an assortment of add-on effects. The cost of the flood might be much higher than the arc of the flood itself. And this may be about very sensible precautionary measures, or it may be about hysteria that is not warranted by the actual risk. But it suggests that if we perceive the costs imposed by risks in a very isolated way, as the day or week or month that the thing happens, we won't get an adequate picture.
Mm-hmm. Right. So say you were a regulator in a model community, so to speak, and the idea of a flood, perhaps related to inadequate storm protection on the coast, were a potential risk. What you were speaking about before reminded me of one of your other theoretical principles that you've written about, the precautionary principle. How would this, what we've been talking about up to this point, come to bear on this principle?
Okay, well, this isn't so hypothetical because I've been a regulator and I'm currently a regulator, though speaking only in my personal academic capacity. The precautionary principle has many different forms. Let's take the crudest form, which says that in the face of a risk, we shouldn't require a demonstration that the risk is certainly going to come to fruition. We want to recognize the existence of uncertainty and impose on the proponent of the action or the risk-creating steps a burden of demonstration of some kind, or we want to impose regulation even if cause and effect relationships, cause, action, effect, badness, hasn't been demonstrated. So the precautionary principle is meant to say that we will take precautions in the face of uncertain risks. In my view, we should be, what's the right word, very skeptical of the precautionary principle. And this is in a way a fussy objection, but I'm going to make it anyway. The fussy objection is that the precautionary principle in the form I just stated is self-defeating because the precautions you take will themselves create risks of uncertain magnitude. So if you take risks with respect to a flood, if you take steps to reduce a flood risk, you will do X and Y and Z, and X and Y and Z will all create risks of various sorts. If they involve economic cost, that will impose risks on the people who have to face those costs. Those with some probability will cause harm, potentially of high magnitude. They could cause price increases. They could cause unemployment. They could cause increases in expense faced by people who can't readily bear those increases. And this is emphatically not meant as an argument against steps to reduce the risk of flood damage. I'm very much in favor of those, but not because of the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle seems to have bite, I think, because we focus on a subset of the risks that are at stake. So to say that we should have a precautionary principle and therefore outlaw nuclear power disregards the risks that outlawing nuclear power imposes, including climate-related risks. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't outlaw nuclear power. That's a separate question. But to answer it, we need to look at the full assortment of risks, looking at their magnitude and their probabilities, and to build in margins of safety against some kinds of risk might be a good idea, surely often is a good idea. So precautions are great, but we have to be very careful that the precautions don't themselves violate the precautionary principle, because with some probability they threaten to impose risk. So this is a way of saying we want a full spectrum approach to risk and risk reduction in a way that's focused to the extent that we can on costs and benefits. It may be that in the face of uncertainty, especially with respect to catastrophic risks or irreversible risks, we want to build in a margin of safety. In fact, I think that's a really good idea. But we want to look at the risks associated with the margin of safety. So maybe an intuitive way to put it is, if you decided today that you were going to stay home and do nothing because any activity creates a risk of some kind, COVID-19, getting hit by a car, having a heart attack as you're walking, that wouldn't be a good idea. And one reason it wouldn't be a good idea is staying home and doing nothing also imposes risks. And so the precautionary principle that you were invoking to stay home also tells you, get out of the house. And you should look at the full assortment of risks associated with staying home and getting out of the house. And of course, risk reduction isn't the only thing we want in life. We also want to have good lives. And that also bears on how to think about the precautionary principle. So I think the precautionary principle has some good political uses, but as an analytic tool, we can do better.
Right. Yeah, and it's also been teased, if you will, on the grounds that if we were to follow the precautionary principle, we would act almost like crazy people, never doing anything.
And I don't
of
agree
course.
with that objection. So I want to say the precautionary principle is self-defeating because it forbids the very steps it requires. I don't want to say we do nothing, because doing nothing violates the precautionary principle. You'll be poor and you'll be sick with some
Yeah,
probability.
which is why the full range is necessary. We need to take that into account. So if we were just to up the ante from the house example, and we raise the risk of catastrophe, let's just say, and suppose we're living in a war zone. So in fact, going out has potentially catastrophic risks. But since we're in a war zone, as you said, we're taking the full range of risks into account. We're supposing that we're also the house could get destroyed with us inside. So there's a risk of actually staying inside, and in fact, actually, however, taking action also has a high cost. We have to leave a potentially safe abode. When both risk A on one side of the spectrum, or one side of the distribution, risk B on the other side, and also cost of action in either direction, when those are increased, how do we then? And it seems to me like you are advocating some sort of cost-benefit analysis, whether that's really rigorous kind of pencil and paper, or also just intuitive. It seems to me like that's part of the solution that you propose.
Completely. So if the question is, what should you do with respect to the question of food safety, let's say, there are steps that can be taken that can reduce risks from food that are relatively low cost and pretty high benefit. They'll save some lives. And there are other steps you could take that would be minimally beneficial and very costly. And so for every case, you want to assess costs and benefits as best you can. It may be that the monetized costs and the monetized benefits won't tell you everything you need to know. And it might be that you care about distributional factors. So it might be that you have a regulation to protect coal miners, let's say, and the costs would be borne by relatively wealthy consumers, and the benefits would be enjoyed by people who are really struggling, whose life and health is at risk. And I would urge that if that's so, the distributional considerations quite matter. It might be that there's uncertainty, so for some of the costs and benefits, you don't have a point estimate, you just have a band. It could save a maximum of, I'm going to make up a number, 200 lives and a minimum of 50 lives. And then there are some kind of familiar techniques about what you do in the face of uncertainty on the cost and benefit side. But many governments, and President Obama, for whom I worked for 4 years, was insistent on cataloging the costs and benefits of action. And people often are a little sad about the idea of using that as the analytic tool. But on reflection, if you are trying to do something with respect to air pollution, let's say, and it would cost an enormous amount, and the costs would be borne, let's say, by some combination of workers and consumers and polluters, often workers and consumers mostly, often, and the benefits would be enjoyed by some combination of consumers and workers. Be good to know the magnitude of both of those. And President Obama believed, and I was glad he believed this, that if the costs are really high and the benefits are modest, then we should do something other than that. We should do something that would have a meaningful impact and that wouldn't hammer, let's say, people who are struggling to get by.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And when uncertainty increases on either end, again, of a full spectrum of risks that we've taken into account, it seems like, from what you're saying, in a way, we're paralyzed in the middle because we don't know. I mean, on both, unlike perhaps a traditional precautionary principle theorist, you're saying there's a 180-degree range of risks in both directions that we can be concerned about. So the increase in uncertainty would, in theory, paralyze someone who's trying to make an important decision that has high costs potentially. Is there a way to parse out what to do in a situation like that when the extremes are blurry?
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. I hope it wouldn't paralyze. It would make things harder. But let's suppose we have a regulation that would cost very little. Take your preferred currency, dollars, euros, pounds, it's modest. The benefits will be somewhere between 500 lives saved and 8,000 lives saved. And this is an extreme example of a high band of uncertainty. But some scientists say it's a carcinogen, let's say. Some say you save 800, and others say you save 5,000, or whatever. Do it, because on the most pessimistic assumption of how beneficial it's going to be, the benefits crush the costs. So do it. Or let's suppose you have a high band of uncertainty where at the most beneficial end, the benefits are modest and the costs are really high. Don't do it, because even if the most optimistic set of benefits occurs, it's just not worth it. And if this seems exotic, I think in ordinary life we sometimes intuitively think this way in terms of whether we take a job, whether we make some purchase. We think of the benefits of either, and we think of worst case and best case, and we compare those to the costs of doing the relevant thing, let's say moving or parting with your money to buy the product. And regulators can do that. They do. we did under President Obama, and this has been done under President Bush and President Clinton, and this is not unfamiliar to find a band of uncertainty with respect to both benefits and costs, and to think in easy cases on the most pessimistic assumption, is it still worth it? On the most optimistic assumption, is it nonetheless not worth it? Speaking of benefits here. And we might have hard cases where the band of benefits, let's say, is both very wide and produces uncertainty about whether it's worth it. And then the best next step is to get the experts to think harder, see if you can narrow the band of uncertainty, collect more data. And if you can't do that, then it will be a genuinely hard choice. And it might be that it's a political choice, not in a pejorative sense, but in a sense of what do you want to do when uncertainty takes the following form. And it may be that there's a moral commitment that can help with that.
Yeah, and it sounds to me like to a large degree, when you do have really hard decisions to make, unclear outcomes, large degrees of uncertainty, and potentially high costs, it is only fair to let a democratic process kind of take the lead on making that decision. But again, as your work has pointed out, there is such a thing as choice architecture, and nudges, if you will, are ubiquitous in the sense that no matter how a choice structure, and I'm sure you'll be able to very succinctly explain what that is, no matter how it's set up, there is some preset influence on how that process is, on how a decision is made by, let's just say, within a democratic process. So when we're working out how to frame choices so that people can make the hard ones in the right way and in a fair way, are there any rules of thumb?
Okay, so there are two different issues we're exploring. First, how should regulators proceed in the face of risks? Some cases are easy, regulate. Some cases are easy, don't do it. Some cases are hard because we have a band of uncertainty that doesn't allow us to make a cost-benefit judgment, emphasizing that the cost-benefit analysis might not be all you need to know. You might care about fair distribution, just as an example. Okay, then we're saying that in the hard cases, there's a democratic judgment to be made. Agreed, but we want to be very careful not to end there, because the question is, what are the criteria by which participants in the democratic process should decide to proceed? And that is extremely important to ask. So it isn't just, the elected representative think X or they think Y, and we don't know why. It should be that we can discuss why. It might be they think that the burden of uncertainty should not be faced by those who are at the bottom of the economic ladder, let's say. That's an idea. I think it's an appealing idea. It might be that the burden of uncertainty shouldn't lead to a potentially significant downturn in economic growth. That's another idea that also has appeal. And so that's about how participants in democratic processes should proceed. Some academics, I should say, like the idea very much, just let the democratic process decide. As a more than occasional regulator myself, I find that true but less helpful, because those of us who are public officials in a democratic process can't just put a finger to the wind and say, what does the democratic process think? And if we did, and it blew there rather than there, I'm not sure that would be the rule of decision. Try to figure out what's right, of course by reference to values that the public holds. But that's more complicated. Okay, so that's easy cases and hard cases in democracy. That's kind of a reckless tour of the horizon. Then there's a question of choice architecture, which is familiarly used for, e.g., how you set up a retirement plan or a healthcare plan, or how you set up a grocery store or a website. And the point is that the design of a retirement plan or a website will often have extremely powerful effects on what people end up choosing. Hence, it's choice architecture. If people are asked, do you want to enroll in a program? It's easy, just click. The participation rate will be typically much smaller than they are if they are automatically enrolled in a program and asked, do you want to get out of this program? It's easy, just click. And there's a Nobel Prize winning theorem that says that those two designs should produce the same outcomes. They don't. You get a much higher participation rate under opt-out than opt-in. If in a grocery store, the first things you see are Coke and Pepsi and chocolates, the sell rate for those goods are likely to be significantly higher than if you have to walk to the back of the store to find those. And if the first things you see are, let's say, Diet Coke and Diet Pepsi and something that isn't chocolate. So choice architecture really matters to outcomes. And the idea of nudging is to try to design choice architecture so it makes people better off as judged by themselves. So automatic enrollment in savings plans is arguably the right way to go because people deem themselves to be better off if they're automatically enrolled in savings plans. Now, this isn't like a truth that's built into the structure of the universe. We need to know what the population is and what the savings plan is. If it's a terrible plan, if the population needs the money now, it's probably not a good plan. But in the United Kingdom and Denmark and the United States and many other places, automatic enrollment seems to be successful. And that could be an engine for helping us think about many forms of choice architecture, whether people should be automatically enrolled in things, whether we want warnings and disclosures and reminders, whether we want simplification, and this is a long list.
Yeah, and in fact, we've also seen that things like green defaults can also work at a corporate level and have exactly that distribution between 1 and 90%, and then once the green default is introduced, it flips. 10 to 90 and then 90 to 10.
It's a very significant increase in use of green energy from switching from do you want to be in green energy to do you want to leave green energy? A lot of people don't bother to go into green energy, but if they're asked if they want to leave green energy, they either because of inertia or because of conscience say, no, I'll stay green.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, clearly this is something that we could go on talking about a lot longer. And I'd like to actually, just on this particular point, thank you for, in this work you were referencing from, I think, the beginning of this year, broadening my perspective a little bit. And I think our whole conversation has about how the background kind of hidden choices and ways that things are structured do affect how things work within systems, whether that system is a society or whether it's a market economy. Beyond that, Professor Sunstein, thank you very much for joining me today. I think this is a perfect note. Although, again, I'd love to speak more, but I think it's a perfect note to wrap up today, and just say thank you for coming on the call.
Thank you. I greatly enjoyed it. Thanks so much.